The next day, the time came for the welcome ceremony for the new students. Lu Fan, Kin Q, and Zio Man started heading towards the academy. Along the way, Lu Fan, who had his hands in his pants pockets, explained to them that life professions and combat professions did not attend the welcome ceremony together. Kin Q, who was holding a magical staff in one hand, extended her other hand towards him and began looking into his eyes. Blushing slightly, she replied that it was true and added that because of this reason Han-Ki had to go somewhere else. Zio Man, who had one hand resting on the sword's hilt, placed the other on her waist. She turned her head towards him and with a calm look asked why there was so much noise in his room last night. Lu Fan started to look at her and with a smile decided to come up with an excuse. But at that moment, they arrived at the entrance of the academy where there were two students. As soon as Kin Q and Zio Man were spotted, both students blushed. One of them caught everyone's attention and quickly asked them to take a look. The other student explained that these two were the most beautiful girls. One was a mage and the other was a swordsman. Upon hearing this, Kin Q, who was holding the magical staff with both hands, began to look down at the ground and couldn't help but blush. According to them, she was beautiful and on par with being the most popular girl in the academy. Everyone wanted to go to a secret realm with a beauty like her. They were even willing to risk their lives and wanted to be her boyfriends. Zio Man, who was holding the sword in her hand, turned her head back and couldn't help but get nervous and blush. Upon closer inspection, the students saw that they were not alone. Next to them was Lu Fan. Seeing this, they started wondering if both of them were his girlfriends. The three entered the room. Kin Q turned her head to one side, closed her eyes, began waving goodbye to Zio Man with her hand, and explained that yesterday Professor Gu had told them that students who had awakened hidden professions should sit in the front row. Upon hearing this, Zio Man couldn't help but feel somewhat surprised and confused at the same time. Seeing that she couldn't sit next to Kin Q, she decided to go to the back part. Lu Fan simply began to walk and upon seeing what was in front of him, he couldn't help but be somewhat amazed. All the students present in the room turned their heads to see the beauties, Kin Q and Zio Man. Among them sat Hongwu, who started staring at Lu Fan with an aggressive look. Lu Fan's gaze fixed on him. He knew that this student was quite familiar to him. After thinking for a moment, he remembered that this guy was Hongwu, the arrogant student he had seen at the trial. Upon remembering this, he couldn't help but be somewhat surprised. He silently stared at Hongwu for several seconds. He decided to be a good person. He walked by his side, turned his head towards him, closed his eyes, started smiling, and greeted him with a nod. Far from greeting him back, Hongwu began to look at him with an aggressive gaze, clenched his teeth tightly and couldn't help but start getting angry. A few days ago, once he left the trial, he grabbed the director by his shirt and started crying. He turned his head towards him and with a serious look, he asked him if he really believed that he was number one. He asked him to take a look at the list and then compare his performance with Lu Fan's. He was very angry with Lu Fan because he had made him lose the respect that the director had for him. He began to stare at him and couldn't help but feel happy since he finally had the chance to see him again. Zio Man moved to another row of seats, put her hand behind her head, started looking at Lu Fan and couldn't help but think that suddenly dividing the hidden professions was foolish. She actually didn't care about this. The only thing she worried about was that now Lu Fan would be alone with Kin Q. Several seconds later, Lu Fan and Kin Q approached the front row of seats, and when they looked to the side, they saw a person sitting there who was quite familiar to them. This person was Lu Fan's neighbor. While she had her hands resting on her knees, she turned her head towards him, started looking into his eyes, and remained silent. Lu Fan immediately recognized her, closed his eyes, and forced a smile at her. Kin Q was somewhat surprised and started looking at her before asking him if the two of them knew each other. He turned his head towards her, and with a smile he explained to her that she was their neighbor, who lived in Villa number 2. She started looking at him and while she was starting to blush, she told him that she understood him. It didn't take her long to realize that she had come in second place in the trial. She thought that she was beautiful and talented. Both of them sat next to his neighbor and began talking to each other. Two students sitting behind him started talking about them. One of them pointed at him and told his friend that this academy was great because Lu Fan was surrounded by beautiful women. His friend replied that it didn't matter since he must be a suck-up. They decided to be brave and go directly ask for her phone number. While all the students were talking to each other, someone went up on stage and asked them to be quiet. This man was wearing glasses and a stylish suit. He started climbing onto the stage, closed his eyes, and introduced himself as Zhao Shengming, the vice principal of the academy. and professor in the Department of Magic. He had the Electric Mage Combat class and was level 78. He turned his head towards the students and with a serious look, on behalf of Longdu University, he welcomed all the new students. He started touching his glasses with his hand. He didn't like formalities or speaking in vain, so he informed them that next, the professors would be handing out their identification cards. At the same time, he wanted to inform them about some academy rules. Teacher Gu approached the students and began to hand out their identification cards. His neighbor took the card with both hands and started silently observing it. The teacher approached Lu Fan, turned her head towards him, and with a pleasant smile handed him his identification card. He extended his hand towards her to take the card, started looking at the teacher, and smiled. Vice Principal Zhao Shengeming explained to the students that the identification card was their credential at Longdu Academy. The card would store points, which were the currency of the academy. These points were needed to access the secret realms provided by the school, and to purchase weapons, potions, etc. Each student's initial points were proportional to their trial score. Lu Fan took the identification card in his hand, brought it close to his face, and while he was observing it, a system window appeared informing him that he had 13,539 points. While the vice principal was explaining this, a student stood up and extended his hand to indicate that he had a question. He knew that the difficulty of the provincial trials varied from province to province, so it was easier to get a high score in provinces with lower difficulty. To him, this was unfair. The vice principal, who had his hands behind his back, was somewhat impressed. He started staring at the student and explained that the academy had already taken this into account. The trial scores had been calculated based on the different provincial exams, dividing them by a difficulty factor to obtain points. The more difficult the exam, the smaller this difficulty factor would be. He decided to explain this better with an example. This year, the most difficult trial had been in the southern province, and students' scores from that province were divided by the smallest difficulty factor, which was 96. Lu Fan, who was holding his identification card in his hand, began to look at the vice principal, and thought that these points were all the money he had in Longdu Academy. The vice principal started approaching the students, extended his hand to one side, and revealed that these points were temporary. The evaluation of new students after a month would determine everyone's points again. He closed his eyes and explained to them that the first 30 students of the admission exam would have the opportunity to enter the Qingyun class. The students who entered this class would receive special treatments, such as access to restricted areas, skill exchange, special equipment, as well as the right to move to the villa area, among others. The students behind Lu Fan started talking among themselves. The guy with gray hair turned his head towards his friend and explained that he had never heard of it before entering the academy. His friend, who had his arms crossed, turned his head towards him and replied that he hadn't heard of that either. But now they were going to have the opportunity to move to the villa area. Lu Fan, who was sitting in front of them with a serious look, thought that this meant he currently had the qualification to be number 1 in the Qingyun class. But if he lost this qualification, then he would have to move out of villa number 1. Upon seeing that many students wanted to enter the Qingyun class, the vice principal took out a remote control, extended his hand to one side, pressed the power button, and with a serious look, explained to them that one could not be at ease when entering this class since any student could challenge another student in combat. Only those who won could keep their place. While he was holding the controller in his hand, he extended it towards the ceiling, causing a leaderboard window to start appearing behind him. He began looking at the students and revealed to them that if a student from the class lost, they had to give up their spot in the class to the challenger. Additionally, a student from Qingyun's class could not refuse the challenge. Several seconds later, the leaderboard appeared behind him. With a calm look on his face, he mentioned that there were now a total of 30 members in Qingyun's class. They were the top students of the trial, basically ranking within the top 30. The director announced that in first place was the champion of the southern province, the Dragon Master Lu Fan. Upon seeing this, all the students were shocked. Lu Fan stood up from his chair, pushed it back, closed his eyes, and couldn't help but feel superior to everyone else. The two students who had previously mocked him started talking to each other again. One of them told his friend that it couldn't be true that a brown-noser dog was number 1. He also asked his friend if it was true that he had a dragon. Upon hearing this, his friend asked him to speak more quietly so Lu Fan wouldn't hear them. He explained that he did have a dragon. Now they were lost. Even if he only had some kind of land dragon, they wouldn't be able to confront him. It no longer surprised them that he was the top student in the southern province. Lu Fan stood up, turned his head towards them, and with a smile began to wave at them. Some students had just searched and hadn't found any scores or videos of his trial. They didn't know if he belonged to a wealthy family who had placed him in first place. After searching a bit, they realized that only the video of the second best from the South Province, named Chen Tianjai, was available. For them, his dragon was very powerful. Chen started staring at Lu Fan and asked the princess when they were going to capture him. He was ready to listen to her instructions. The princess, who was also staring at Lu Fan intently, explained to Chen that his abilities were still not very clear. She asked him not to rush and ordered him to first investigate his intentions. Qin Qiu, who was sitting next to him, asked if it wasn't asking others to challenge him by showing off like that. Lu Fan sat down on the chair, rested both hands on the chair's arms, closed his eyes and explained to her that he didn't expect this to happen. The neighbor sitting next to him turned her head towards him and silently watched him. Several hours later, it was 12:30 and the entrance ceremony for the new students came to an end. Lu Fan left the room and felt relieved as it had finally finished. He thought it was time for Xiao Fei to level up and unlock a new form. He, Qin Qiu, and Xiao Man left the room and started walking. While he had one hand in his pocket, he extended the other towards them and decided to go to the secret realm hall to see what kind of wonders the academy offered in this secret realm. At that moment, someone behind him caught his attention. Lu Fan slightly turned his head back and with a serious look, began to wonder what was happening. This person was none other than Hongwu, who clenched his fist tightly, started staring at Lu Fan and asked him to wait as he had something to tell him. Lu Fan slightly turned his head towards him, started looking into his eyes with a serious gaze and remained silent, wondering what this guy wanted to talk about. At the same time, the princess, Chen, and Chui Hongtai left the room and upon seeing what was happening, the three were shocked. With a furious look, Hongwu began pointing at Lu Fan with his finger and challenged him to a duel. Several seconds later, Professor Gu and the principal came out of the room and upon hearing this, they were somewhat surprised. Lu Fan turned his body backwards, started staring at Hongwu and asked him if he really wanted to challenge him. Hongwu began to smile and explained to him that as Vice Director Zhao had said a moment ago, the first 30 members of the Qingyun class could not refuse a challenge. He urged Lu Fan by asking why he didn't accept the challenge if he truly believed he had the ability to be number one. He began to look at Lu Fan with a gaze full of hatred. He had not been able to see either the trial videos or his scores. He thought that he had secured the first place thanks to the strength of his dragons. He believed that if he fought against him in a one-on-one battle, he would win. In an instant, a crowd of students approached them. While Lu Fan had his hands in his pants pockets, he turned his body towards Hongwu and began to look at him with a serious gaze, and decided to accept his challenge. Upon hearing this, Hongwu couldn't help but feel happy. With a smile, he decided to bet 200 points with him. Upon hearing that he was only going to bet 200 points, Lu Fan was somewhat surprised, but then he thought that for him it should be a lot of points. He took a step forward, placed his hand in front of Qin Qiu indicating to her not to get in the way, and began to look at Hongwu. With a smile, he also decided to bet 200 points. Qin Qiu, who was standing behind him and holding the magic staff with both hands, was somewhat surprised and confused at the same time. Seeing that both had accepted the challenge, the other students couldn't help but be somewhat surprised. Remembering that Lu Fan was the Dragon Master and ranked number 1, they thought this promised to be interesting. Although some of them didn't know if a Dragon Master was similar to a mage. The princess, who had her arms crossed and was staring at Lu Fan, thought that this was a good opportunity to investigate thoroughly. She asked Chen to watch his every move. Hongwu clenched both fists tightly, assumed an offensive stance, and with a smile told Lu Fan that the fight would begin when he counted to 3. Xiao Man began to look at him and asked Qin Qiu if Lu Fan was going to lose. Qin Qiu, who was standing beside her leaning on the magic staff, started smiling and asked her if she hadn't seen Lu Fan fight. The vice principal and Professor Gu began observing both of them and remained silent. Hongwu began to count. He extended his fist forward and a powerful golden energy appeared around it. Qin Qiu started to look at Lu Fan and told Xiao Man that she was going to know in a moment who was going to win and lose. Hongwu just counted to 3, gained momentum, started moving quickly towards him, prepared to hit him with his fist, and told him that the fight had already begun. Lu Fan slightly turned his head back and while he was watching how slowly he was approaching, he simply remained silent. Let me know in the comments who will be the winner, and if Lu Fan will call Xiaoyu to beat up this guy. This is the end of the video. If you guys want to see the next part, then don't forget to subscribe and like the video.